in life, we cannot ever go back. And I think sometimes this image of resilience that will bounce back to our old form when we've gone through a severe crisis, or we've lost somebody, or we've been diagnosed with an illness, we really can never go back to our old form. I think it's about finding a new form. And so this image of bouncing forward really perfectly expresses what I wanted to say with the book. I wrote this book because PTSD, or post-traumatic stress, is so much talked about, and very few people have heard of post-traumatic growth, because it's kind of a new science, and there are studies, new information, new materials coming out pretty much every week. And I think the idea of post-traumatic growth as such is old. It's as old as the oldest book. Jesus' story is a story of post-traumatic growth. Buddha's story is a story of post-traumatic growth. Hollywood knows about post-traumatic growth. Batman is a story of post-traumatic growth. But what's new is that there's actually a science behind it of how people can actually emerge from adversity stronger and wiser and more compassionate. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was because when I got ill in my 20s, I was not resilient. And I did fall apart. I pretty much went from being a world traveler and hiking the Mount Everest region to being bedridden within weeks, really. It happened very fast. And I was bedridden for about 8 months. And I did not take that well. And I was very desperate. And so after recovering, I wondered how other people have experienced things much worse than what I've gone through. Well, how did they manage to climb out of that abyss? How did they manage to go through that crisis? So one thing I want to say up front is that post-traumatic growth is not the opposite of post-traumatic stress. It doesn't mean that people don't go through post-traumatic stress. On the contrary, it's the stress, it's the struggle that can lead to the emotional growth. And what Richard Tedeschi found is he's been working with survivors, bereaved parents, veterans, people with illnesses for over 3 decades. And he didn't invent a fancy theory. It was the other way around. He was working with patients, and he was surprised that again and again, people kept telling him, I'm not glad that this happened to me. I wish this wouldn't have happened, but I've learned something from it. And so he and his colleagues, they distilled it down to 5 main areas of post-traumatic growth. So the first is personal strength. And maybe you kind of know the saying, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So many people come out of such a crisis with a deeper understanding of their own personal strength. Deeper relationships, that's something I've heard again and again, because in a crisis, you kind of find out who your true friends are, right? There are those that say, call me if you need something, and then they're gone. And then there are the people who are really there for us. So, deeper relationships. Discovering new perspectives. Pretty much everybody in their book, in Bouncing Forward, changed their lives after a traumatic event happened to them, and put them on a trajectory that maybe they'd never thought they'd go on, and to make choices that they'd never thought they would make. And I'll tell you some examples of that. And then appreciating life. That's a big one that comes up again and again. And I don't know if you've had this experience, like you come out of the hospital and people outside are bitching about traffic, or that somebody has cut them off on the freeway, right? And you go like, well, if that's your biggest problem, you're lucky. Congratulations. So many of the people have told me how they started appreciating small things that they were too busy to notice before they were diagnosed with that illness or before they had that accident. And a more intense spirituality. And Rhonda Cornum is a great example for that because, she's a doctor, she's a trauma surgeon, and she was entirely focused on the material world. She didn't really have any belief. And through that near-death experience, for the first time, did she start to think, well, maybe there's something else out there. And she actually practices meditation now every day. And her outlook on life completely changed. I love that quote by Maya Angelou, who says, nothing will work unless you do. Because post-traumatic growth doesn't usually happen automatically or by itself. It takes work, and it takes methods, and it takes support. Nobody can do it alone. That's another thing that I've learned, because sometimes people think, well, if I'm really strong, I should be able to make it through this by myself. And every psychologist I spoke with, and every person I talked to, at some point they had to realize, no, we don't make it through it by ourselves. And that was also one of the main lessons at the Army Resilience Boot Camp that I went to. Because the Army has realized that projecting only strength and expecting their soldiers to go through fire and somehow come out of that unscathed is unrealistic and actually fatal. So one of the main things they teach soldiers now at the Resilience Boot Camp is to admit fears, to admit weaknesses, to ask for help, to reach out. And another thing, so they've really ditched this, Rambo image completely. And they're working on training the soldiers to communicate openly and honestly, which I thought was beautiful.
Are they doing that with all soldiers?
All soldiers in the U.S. Army participate in that soldier fitness training in one way or another. So many people I spoke with, when they went through a traumatic event, so many thought their life was over, and they would never be happy again, and they would never be able to lead a meaningful life again. And what I'm able to show is that this is not true. And that even after the worst traumas, like losing your child or Auschwitz, Viktor Frankl said that even in Auschwitz, under the most horrible circumstances, even then we have the inner freedom to make decisions. But I think we need to, some of us have that naturally. I think Rhonda Cornum has that naturally.
Right.
She's one of the third of people who are naturally resilient. And I think I'm not naturally resilient, but those of us who are not naturally resilient, I think for us it's a training. And I believe that everybody can learn to be more resilient. I believe it's like a muscle. Like we go to the gym to work out, right? And it's the same with resilience. And to take responsibility for our process. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it. And I think that's the training. And that's where all these methods, meditation, or whatever people find most helpful, that's where that comes in. Because we can fortify ourselves, our inner immune system, so to speak, to deal with challenges. At first I thought that these stories of post-traumatic growth were incredibly rare. That's how I started out. And then now I realize they're everywhere. So that's not to say not everybody grows, but I believe that everybody can grow. And when people hear about it and read about it, I think a lot of people recognize elements of growth that they hadn't really thought of before. So even though people often don't know the term post-traumatic growth, my experience is that a lot of people recognize elements of post-traumatic growth in their own lives and in the lives of others. And even whole communities can experience post-traumatic growth. Countries can experience trauma and post-traumatic growth. And it all depends on, we just had the shooting in San Bernardino, and you see the people who are immediately using it and to increase the fear, to make people more fearful. And you see the people who are there to help and to propose solutions and to be reasonable. After every tragedy, you have both. And I believe we have the freedom to choose our response to it and, hopefully to choose a helpful response, a supportive response.
Well, and that's the other great thing about